The estate that locked itself forever. A Miss Marple case. The gates of Witchwood Hall closed on the night of October the 17th, and by morning, nobody inside them was ever going to leave the same way they came in. 6 people had walked through that iron threshold at dusk. Only 5 would still be breathing at dawn. And the strangest part of it all, the part that made the villagers of St Mary Mead lower their voices when they spoke of it, was that the killer had not entered the house from outside. The killer had already been living inside it for years, and an elderly woman with knitting needles in her handbag was the only person in England who suspected the truth from the very first hour. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, every clock in the West Wing stopped. Not slowed, not broken, stopped, as though something in the house itself had exhaled and forgotten to breathe again. And in the drawing room, beneath the tall, stained-glass window that had watched over 4 generations of the Witchwood family, a body lay on the Persian rug with a single wound above the collarbone and an expression on its face that suggested, very clearly, that the last thing it had seen was somebody it trusted. The village did not sleep that night. The village pretended to, and for the next 11 days, every soul in St Mary Mead would agree, without any of them quite saying so aloud, that the estate had locked itself forever. There is a stretch of countryside in the south of England where the hedgerows grow so high in autumn that a traveller passing through can drive for nearly a mile without seeing the sky. It is the kind of road where the light comes in slanted through the branches, where the crows keep a respectful distance, and where the villages tucked between the folds of the downs still remember the names of the dead. St Mary Mead is one of those villages. It has a post office that also sells tinned peaches, a butcher who closes early on Wednesdays, and a small church with a leaning weather vane that has, according to local tradition, been pointing slightly southeast since before the war. Nothing much happens there, and that, of course, is precisely why so much of what happens there matters. You would not think, walking down its single main street, that anything darker than a gossiping tea circle could ever settle behind its lace curtains. You would notice the neat gardens, the primroses grown too late into the season, the smell of bread from Mrs. Higgins' bakery drifting down toward the war memorial. You would perhaps see an old woman in a woolen cardigan tending to her front hedge with a pair of blunted shears, and you would not think twice about her. That, in fact, would be your first mistake. Because the old woman was Miss Jane Marple, and Miss Jane Marple had a habit of noticing precisely those things that everyone else chose to overlook. She was the sort of woman other people described using vague, diminishing words. Sweet, doddery, harmless. They said she reminded them of their aunt in Bournemouth or the retired schoolteacher who had once given them a boiled sweet as a child. They said she was fond of gardening. They said she meant well. And every one of them, without exception, would have been astonished to know that beneath the pale blue of her eyes lived one of the most patient, most methodical, and most unforgiving minds in the whole of the county. Miss Marple did not believe in evil the way novelists believed in evil. She believed in something far more troubling. She believed that human nature was consistent, that the man who lied about the price of turnips at the parish fete was the same man who, in a different set of circumstances, might lie about far darker things, that the woman who quietly poisoned her sister's dahlias out of jealousy carried inside her the same quiet talent that, in another life, might poison a husband. She had watched St Mary Mead for more than 50 years, and she had come to understand that the village was not a small world. The village was every world, only smaller. Everything that happened in London, in Paris, in the vast, murderous cities of the earth, happened here too, on a scale you could see across a garden wall. She had, in her long and outwardly uneventful life, seen the truth of it. She had seen a curate's wife go mad from loneliness. She had seen a gentle boy grow into a man who beat his mother. She had seen a woman inherit a fortune and stop speaking to her oldest friend, not from pride, but from a small, tidy little fear that her friend now knew too much. And she had learned, from every one of these small, ordinary tragedies, the shape of the larger ones that occasionally arrived from outside. That was how it began, on the afternoon of October the 16th, when the letter arrived from Witchwood Hall. It came in a heavy cream envelope, of the sort that no one in St. Mary Mead used anymore, addressed in a slanting, old-fashioned hand that Miss Marple recognised at once. Lavinia Witchwood, Dowager Lady Witchwood, had written to her from the estate 7 miles beyond the village. They had known each other since childhood, when their governesses had shared complaints over weak tea. They had not been what one would call close. They had been something more useful than that. They had been consistent. Every Christmas, a card. Every summer, a small note. And now, in the middle of autumn, a letter that began with a single sentence. "I am afraid, Jane, that someone in this house intends to kill me before the month is out." Miss Marple read the sentence twice. She read it a third time with her spectacles taken off, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. Then she folded the letter carefully back into its envelope, put on her second-best coat, and walked down the lane to the post office to inquire, with mild casualness, about the next train to Witchwood Holt. The train ran only twice a day. She caught the 4:15. She sat by the window and watched the hedgerows go past, and she thought, not about the letter, but about a small incident she had once witnessed in the village when she was 19 years old, in which a young man named Thomas Pruitt had smiled at his cousin over the churchyard gate, 3 days before the cousin was found drowned in the mill pond. It had never been proved. It never would be. But Miss Marple had never forgotten the smile, because she had recognised it. It was the smile of a person who had already made up his mind. She was thinking of that smile as the train pulled into Witchwood Holt in the last grey light of the afternoon. And she was thinking of it still, some 40 minutes later, when the iron gates of Witchwood Hall swung slowly closed behind her, and the estate that would soon look itself forever received its final guest. The hall was older than the village, older, some said, than the parish records that pretended to keep track of it. It sat at the end of a long drive lined with plane trees that had been planted in the 17th century by a Witchwood who was said to have been a friend of Cromwell, and later, when circumstances changed, a friend of the king. The house itself was a great grey block of stone with too many chimneys and too few windows. A house that had been extended and altered and misused by so many generations that no 2 rooms sat at quite the same level. In the west wing, the floors sloped down toward the fireplace. In the east wing, they sloped up toward the roof. It was said that a marble dropped in the long gallery would roll, slowly and without hurry, all the way to the servants' staircase and disappear into the cellar. The gardens were the best-kept thing about it. Lavinia had seen to that. The yew hedges were clipped with the discipline of a regiment. The roses in the walled garden had been coaxed to bloom past their proper season by a gardener named Bramble, who had been at Witchwood since he was 14 and who was now 71 and refused to retire. There was a maze at the eastern end of the lawn. It had been planted for a wedding in 1893, and it had never been redesigned. Generations of Witchwood children had lost themselves inside it. One of them, a small boy named Edmund, had lost himself in it for 6 hours in 1911 and had come out of it when the search parties finally found him at dusk, refusing to say what he had seen. He had grown up, married unhappily, and died young. Nobody at Witchwood ever spoke of the maze without lowering the voice half a note. The household, on the evening Miss Marple arrived, consisted of 6 people. There was Lavinia herself, Dowager Lady Witchwood, 78 years old and every inch the mistress of the house. She had once been described, in a society column of a newspaper long since folded, as a woman of granite disguised as porcelain. She was thin, upright, exact. She wore grey silk to dinner and pearls to breakfast, and she had not raised her voice, so far as anyone could remember, since 1934. There was her son, Sir Rupert Witchwood, 49, the current baronet, who had inherited the title but not, as everyone in the village well knew, the estate itself, which had been left in trust to his mother for her lifetime. He was a large, florid man, with a bark of a laugh and a habit of standing too close to fires. He had married, in his early 30s, a considerably younger woman from London, and had spent the following 16 years discovering that he had made, financially and emotionally, an expensive mistake. That wife was Celia. Celia Witchwood, 38, cool as a river stone, was a former actress of moderate success and considerable beauty. She had never been welcomed at Witchwood by her mother-in-law, and she had never pretended otherwise. She spent as little time at the estate as her husband allowed, and rather more time in London than any of them would openly admit. There was Dr. Ambrose Prendergast, the family physician, 63 years old, a widower, and Lavinia's oldest surviving friend. He had attended the household for 31 years. He had signed the death certificate of Lavinia's husband. He had delivered Rupert. He had, on one particular evening in 1958, kept a family secret so completely that even the family had eventually forgotten they had ever told it to him. He drove a very old Rover and lived in a cottage on the estate. There was Miss Harriet Vane, Lavinia's companion. She was 31, spectacled, quiet, and the daughter of a country solicitor who had died in debt. She had been at Witchwood for 4 years. She read aloud in the evenings, wrote the household letters, kept the accounts, and knew, in a way that only paid companions ever know, the precise emotional temperature of every person in the house at any hour of any day. She had in that time been offered marriage exactly once by a curate in a neighbouring parish, and had refused him for reasons she had never explained. And there was Mr. Julian Ashcombe, 34, the newest arrival, who had come down from London the previous month to help catalogue the Witchwood Library. He was a slender, dark-haired man with a scholar's stoop and a very expensive suit. He was said to be writing a book about the private letters of the 18th century Witchwoods. He was polite to everyone and confided in no one. He drank very little. He smiled easily. And there was something, Miss Marple noticed within the first 10 minutes of meeting him, that did not quite match up between the way he spoke and the way he watched. Those were the six. 6 people gathered under one roof on the evening of October the 16th. 6 people who, by breakfast on the morning of the 17th, would have become 5 and a corpse, and a question that would take Miss Jane Marple every ounce of her patient, ordinary, terrible understanding of human nature to answer. Dinner that night was served at 8 in the long dining room, beneath a portrait of a Witchwood in a wig who had voted for the wrong side of every important vote of his lifetime, and had still, somehow, died rich. The fire had been lit. The curtains had been drawn against a rising wind. The candles on the table burned unevenly because the draught from the chimney had never, in 300 years, been properly fixed. Lavinia sat at the head of the table, with the composure of a woman who had spent her entire life sitting at the heads of tables. Rupert sat to her right, already too warm from the wine. Celia sat opposite him, playing with her wedding ring as though it were a small, unpleasant animal she could not quite decide whether to keep. Dr. Prendergast sat next to Lavinia, and to his other side sat Miss Marple, who had been given the seat of honour with a politeness so exquisite it counted, in that household, as an act of alarm. Miss Vane sat at the far end of the table, quiet, watching, taking in everything and admitting to nothing. And Mr. Ashcombe sat opposite Miss Vane, occasionally looking up from his plate to smile at her, in a way that Miss Marple noticed at once, and about which she formed, silently, several private opinions. The conversation was ordinary. It was almost aggressively ordinary. They talked about the weather. They talked about a new play in the West End. They talked about a cousin in Yorkshire who had lost a great deal of money on a horse. Nobody talked about the letter. Nobody talked about the estate or the will, or the fact that a woman of 78 had summoned her oldest childhood acquaintance from another village on 24 hours' notice. And Lavinia Witchwood, who could preside over any silence in England as though it were a table setting, gave no indication whatever that she believed she would not be alive to see the end of the month. Only once, over the fish, did anything unusual happen. It was so small that anybody else would have missed it. Miss Marple did not miss it. Lavinia, in the middle of a sentence about the roses in the walled garden, looked up sharply, not at any of the guests, but at the door. She held the look for perhaps a second and a half. Then she returned, without comment, to her sentence about the roses. Nobody else at the table appeared to notice, but when Miss Marple, a moment later, glanced casually toward the door herself, she saw, standing just inside the shadow of the hall, one of the household, in a position that entirely failed to match the excuse they would later give for being there. She said nothing. She smiled at Dr. Prendergast, who was telling a mild story about a patient. She lifted her wineglass and set it down again, and in her mind, quietly, without hurry, she began the work she had come to Witchwood to do. Because Miss Marple knew, with the certainty of a woman who had lived a great many years and paid attention to every one of them, that the letter had not been sent because Lavinia was afraid. The letter had been sent because Lavinia already knew who it was, and somewhere in the house, somebody else knew that she knew. After dinner, the household separated in that quiet, elaborate way that old English families have of pretending they are not avoiding each other. Rupert took his brandy into the smoking room. Celia went upstairs with the small, tight smile of a woman who did not intend to come down again that evening. Dr. Prendergast asked Lavinia if she would like him to look in on her before he returned to his cottage, and Lavinia said, with unusual softness, that she would. Miss Vane collected the letters that needed posting in the morning and disappeared into the little office behind the library. And Mr. Ashcombe, with a bow to Miss Marple that was almost too well done, said he had some work to finish among the books, which left Miss Marple, for perhaps 4 minutes, alone with Lavinia in the drawing-room. The fire was low. The wind was up. Somewhere at the back of the house, a shutter had begun to knock against a stone wall in a small, patient rhythm that nobody had gone to fix. Lavinia looked, in that firelight, older than she had at dinner. Not frightened, not even sad. Simply older, as though the effort of appearing herself had cost her something she was not sure she could afford to spend twice. She said, very quietly, "I am glad you came, Jane." Miss Marple, who had been knitting since the moment she sat down, did not look up. "You have not told me anything yet, my dear." "No," said Lavinia, "I have not." "You will tell me tomorrow?" Lavinia looked into the fire. For a long moment she did not answer at all. Then she said, in a voice so small it might have been mistaken for the settling of a coal, "I will tell you tomorrow, Jane, if tomorrow comes." Miss Marple's needles did not falter, but somewhere behind her spectacles something small and very cold moved into place. She said, in the same conversational voice she used for discussing marmalade, "Then I think perhaps I shall sit up a little while longer, Lavinia. I am not quite ready for bed." Lavinia looked at her then, and for one instant in the dim room the two old women understood one another without speaking. It was the understanding of women who had been girls in the same century, who had watched the same century unravel, and who had learned, from the same long, ordinary lives, that certain things could not be said aloud in certain rooms without the rooms themselves listening. Lavinia said, "Thank you, Jane." Then she rose, kissed Miss Marple lightly on the cheek in a manner that would have astonished anyone who had known her for the past 40 years, and walked out of the drawing-room with her back as straight as it had ever been. She did not come down again. Miss Marple sat by the fire for another hour. She sat with her knitting in her lap and her eyes half closed, and to anyone who had looked in on her, she would have appeared to be a small, tired old woman about to fall asleep in a chair too large for her. In fact, she was doing something quite different. She was listening. She was listening to the house. Old houses, she had long ago discovered, made a particular kind of noise when the people inside them were behaving normally, and a different kind of noise when they were not. Witchwood Hall, that night, was not behaving normally. There were footsteps in the upper corridor that came and went twice without any door opening. There was a murmur of voices from behind the library door that continued longer than any conversation between an employer and a cataloguer had any business continuing. There was, at one point, the very faint clink of a decanter stopper being replaced with too much care by someone who did not want to be heard using it. And once, at nearly 10:30, there was a sound that Miss Marple could not immediately place, and that troubled her more than any of the others. It was the sound of a key being tried, very quietly, in a lock somewhere along the west wing. She did not stand up. She did not go to see. She noted it, the way a bird watcher notes the call of a bird in the dark, and she kept knitting. At 11, Miss Vane came into the drawing room to say good night. She looked, Miss Marple thought, as though she had been crying, although her eyes were dry now and her voice was perfectly even. She said Lavinia had asked not to be disturbed until morning. She said the doctor had already gone. She said the wind was going to be worse before it was better. Then she stood for a moment in the doorway with her hand on the frame, and she said, in a voice quite unlike her usual one, "Miss Marple, if anything happens tonight, if anything at all, you must not go to Lady Witchwood's room alone." Miss Marple looked up. "Why not, my dear?" Miss Vane hesitated. Then she said, "Because that is what she said to me. This afternoon, she said if anything happened, no one was to go alone." She left before Miss Marple could ask her the second question. Miss Marple sat by the fire until the last coal had gone grey. Then she folded her knitting, took up her small candle, and went up the great staircase to the room that had been prepared for her at the eastern end of the corridor. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark with the covers drawn to her chin, and she listened to the wind against the leaded glass, and she thought about a great many things at once in the patient, layered way that had always been her habit. She thought about the way Rupert Witchwood had refused, twice, to meet his mother's eyes across the dinner table. She thought about the small, private smile that had passed between Celia and Julian Ashcombe when nobody was supposed to be watching them, and about how quickly Celia had covered it by asking for the salt. She thought about Dr. Prendergast's hand as he had lifted his wine-glass, and about the very slight, very controlled tremor that had not been there 30 years ago. She thought about Harriet Vane's warning, and about the fact that a paid companion in a household of 5 other people had known, in advance, that something was expected to happen that night. And she thought, over and over, about the sentence in the letter. "I am afraid, Jane, that someone in this house intends to kill me before the month is out." Not somebody. Someone. A word chosen with care by a woman who had spent 78 years choosing her words. Not the servants, not a stranger from the village. Someone. One of the 5 faces at that table. The wind rose. A branch scraped against a window somewhere down the corridor. And in the drawing room below, quietly and without ceremony, every clock in the west wing stopped at 3:17. She did not know it had happened. She would not know until the morning. But she woke, all the same, at almost exactly that hour, with the sudden, unaccountable feeling that a door somewhere in the house had just been closed by a hand that did not want it heard. She lay still for a long time, listening. There was nothing else. Then, very faintly, from the direction of the west wing, there was a single, soft sound. It was neither a cry nor a fall. It was, Miss Marple thought afterwards, the sound of a breath being let out by somebody who had been holding it a long time. She did not get up. She remembered Harriet Vane's warning. She lay in the dark with her hands folded on the coverlet, and she waited for morning, and she prayed, in her own quiet way, for the soul of whoever it was in the west wing who had just stopped needing to hold their breath. Morning came slowly to Witchwood. The wind had dropped in the small hours, and by 7 o'clock a thin grey light was coming in through the tall windows of the corridor. Miss Marple was already dressed. She had been dressed since 6. She had heard the household begin to stir at 1/2 that hour, and she had heard, at 7 precisely, the first of a series of small sounds that told her, quite clearly, that whatever had happened in the west wing had now been discovered. There were quick footsteps on the servants' stair. There was a low, urgent voice. There was a pause, and then the sound of a door being opened and closed very softly, as though the person opening it did not yet want to admit, even to themselves, what they had just seen. Then there was a scream. It was Harriet Vane's scream. Miss Marple recognised it not from having heard it before, but from having heard, in her long life, a great many screams of the same kind. It was not the scream of a woman who had come upon a horror unexpectedly. It was the scream of a woman who had feared a horror all night and had at last been given permission to make a sound about it. Miss Marple went to her door and opened it. The corridor was empty. She walked, without hurry, along the runner of faded red carpet toward the west wing. She met Dr. Prendergast at the corner, coming up the other way with his coat still on and his bag in his hand. He had, evidently, been telephoned at his cottage. His face was the colour of old paper. He said, "Miss Marple, I think it would be better if you—" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that I should like to see her, doctor, if you please." He hesitated. Then he stepped aside. Lavinia Witchwood was in her bed. She was lying on her back, with the covers drawn up almost to her collarbone, in a position of such perfect composure that at first glance she might merely have been sleeping. Her hands were folded on the coverlet. Her hair was still in its evening plait. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no sign of fear. There was, above her collarbone, a single small dark wound, of the sort that a woman who had spent her life in a country house would not immediately recognise, but that Dr. Prendergast, who had spent his life among such wounds in a small country practice, had recognised at once. She had been killed, quite deliberately and quite skillfully, by someone who had known exactly where to strike. And the door of the room had been locked from the inside. The village policeman arrived at 8. Sergeant Hobbs was a large, slow, careful man who had known the Witchwood family for most of his life, and he was not, therefore, a man to jump to conclusions in a house of this kind. He listened to Dr. Prendergast. He looked at the door of Lady Witchwood's bedroom. He asked, in his slow voice, how the door had been opened. Miss Vane, who had answered every question so far with the small, tight precision of a woman who was afraid of saying one word too many, told him that the door had been opened at 7 that morning by the housekeeper, Mrs. Renshaw, who had used the master key from the housekeeper's board because Lady Witchwood had not answered the tea tray. "And the door was locked when Mrs. Renshaw arrived?" Hobbs asked. "Yes." "Locked from inside?" "Yes." "With the key in the inside of the lock?" Miss Vane hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Yes." Hobbs wrote it down. Then he asked to be shown the key, and Miss Vane took him to the bedside table, where the key had been placed after the door was opened, and Hobbs held it in his large, slow hand for some time before he set it down again without comment. Miss Marple watched all of this from the doorway, with her hands folded in front of her. She said nothing. She had already noticed, in the first 10 seconds of entering the room, the 3 things that Sergeant Hobbs had not yet noticed, and that Dr. Prendergast had noticed and had chosen not to mention. She had noticed the position of the little embroidered footstool at the side of the bed. She had noticed the exact angle of the pillow behind Lavinia's head. And she had noticed, on the dressing table by the window, the small, silver-framed photograph of a young man in a military uniform, which had been moved, since the last time she had been in this room 40 years ago, from its proper place on the mantelpiece to a place where anyone lying in the bed could see it, and where anyone entering the room would have to pass it first. She did not mention any of these things. Not yet. She waited. By 9 o'clock, the household had been assembled in the morning room. The fire had been lit for the second time in 12 hours, and the light through the tall windows was the flat, colourless light of an October morning that has not yet decided what kind of day it intends to be. Sergeant Hobbs stood by the fireplace with his notebook. Dr. Prendergast sat in the wing chair by the window, his bag between his feet. Rupert Witchwood, unshaven, in a dressing gown flung over yesterday's shirt, stood by the sideboard and drank a cup of coffee as though it were medicine. Celia Witchwood sat on the sofa with her hands very still in her lap, wearing, Miss Marple noticed, an expression that had been rehearsed in the corridor before the door was opened. Harriet Vane sat in a straight-back chair at the edge of the group, so upright that her shoulders did not touch the wood. Julian Ashcombe stood a little apart from all of them, near the tall glass door that led out to the terrace, and he was looking, with an expression Miss Marple could not entirely place, at the maze at the far end of the lawn. Sergeant Hobbs cleared his throat. He said that Lady Witchwood had been found dead in her bed at 7 that morning. He said that the manner of her death was not natural. He said that the door of her room had been locked from the inside, with the key still in the lock, and that the windows had also been fastened from within. He said that no person could, so far as he could see, have entered or left the room by any of the normal means between the hour of her going to bed and the hour of her being found. And he said, in the same slow voice, that until further inquiries had been made, he would ask, very respectfully, that no one presently in the house should leave the estate. There was a silence. It was not a shocked silence. It was, Miss Marple thought, a silence in which each of the 5 people in the room was rapidly reviewing, in their own private way, the story they intended to tell. Rupert Witchwood was the first to break it. He said, with the loud, false ease of a man who had been rehearsing his voice all night without knowing he was doing it, "Well, of course, Sergeant, of course. Anything we can do. Anything at all." Then he set the coffee cup down on the sideboard with slightly too much force and stared at the carpet. Celia said nothing. Miss Vane said, very quietly, "Sergeant, I think you should know that Lady Witchwood was expecting something to happen to her." Every head in the room turned toward her. "She told you that," Hobbs said. "She told me," Miss Vane said, "yesterday afternoon. She told me that if anything happened during the night, I was not to allow anyone to go to her room alone. She told Miss Marple the same thing, in her own way, over dinner, and she wrote, I believe, to Miss Marple 3 days ago, asking her to come." Every head in the room turned toward Miss Marple. "That is correct," Miss Marple said. The silence in the room changed shape. It was no longer the silence of 5 people preparing stories. It was the silence of 5 people beginning, one by one, to reconsider how much of their story would now be believed. It was Julian Ashcombe who spoke next. He had not moved from his place by the terrace door. He said, without turning around, "Then Lady Witchwood knew who it was." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I believe she did." He turned around then and looked at her, and Miss Marple, who had seen a great many faces in her life in the moment they realized they were being seen, saw in Julian Ashcombe's face the shadow of an expression that lasted less than half a second, and that told her, with absolute clarity, that whatever else he was not a man who had come to Witchwood Hall merely to catalogue books. Sergeant Hobbs, who had missed the look, said heavily, "And did her ladyship, by any chance, tell you who it was, Miss Marple?" "No, Sergeant," said Miss Marple. "She did not. She intended to tell me this morning." The clock on the mantelpiece struck the quarter. It was the only clock in the west wing that was still going. All the others, as the housekeeper would report to Sergeant Hobbs before the day was out, had stopped, without any apparent reason, at 17 minutes past 3. The first day of the investigation was, in its own way, the strangest of all, because everybody in the household behaved, on the surface, exactly as they should have behaved, and yet not one of them behaved as though they were surprised. Sergeant Hobbs, having taken his statements, had telephoned the county town for an inspector, and the inspector, a lean, tired-looking man named Slack, had arrived by motor car at 11 and had begun his work with the polite efficiency of a man who considered his time considerably more valuable than that of any of the people he was interviewing. He set himself up in the library. He asked for each member of the household in turn. He asked them, one by one, the same 3 questions. Where had they been between the hours of 11 and 4? Whether they had heard anything unusual, and whether, to their knowledge, Lady Witchwood had any enemies within the house. The answers he received, taken as a group, formed a portrait so consistent that it was, on second reading, almost too consistent. Rupert Witchwood had, he said, gone to bed at 11:30. He had slept badly. He had heard nothing. He had known of no enemies. His hands, throughout the interview, had rested very still on the arm of the chair, which was, in itself, a piece of information about Rupert Witchwood, whose hands did not usually rest still on anything. Celia Witchwood had, she said, retired shortly after her husband. She had read for perhaps an hour and had then extinguished her lamp. Her bedroom was in the east wing, at the opposite end of the house from Lavinia's. She had heard nothing. She had known of no enemies. She looked at the inspector with the steady, slightly amused eyes of a woman who had spent 16 years being looked at by men with notebooks, and who no longer felt any particular obligation to help them. Dr. Prendergast had left the house, he said, at 10:15. He had walked back to his cottage across the park. He had gone to bed at 11. He had been telephoned at 7 in the morning by Mrs. Renshaw. He had come at once. He was not, so far as he was aware, in possession of any information about enemies. His voice was steady. His eyes, once, moved to the window and did not return for slightly longer than they should have. Harriet Vane had, she said, been in her own room from 10 o'clock onwards. She had written letters until midnight. She had heard footsteps twice in the corridor, both of which she had assumed to be Lady Witchwood's, since her ladyship had been in the habit of walking about at night when she could not sleep. She had known, she said, that Lady Witchwood was afraid. She had not known of whom. Julian Ashcombe had, he said, worked in the library until nearly 1 in the morning. He had gone to bed at approximately 1:10. He had heard, he thought, a door closing somewhere in the west wing at about 2:30, but had assumed it was the wind. He knew of no enemies. He was, he said, merely a visitor and a professional guest. He smiled once, mildly, at the inspector, and the inspector, who did not usually notice such things, wrote in his notebook, in a hand that grew fractionally smaller, the words, "polite." Too polite. At 12:30, Inspector Slack summoned Miss Marple. He was, in his own way, a courteous man, and he had heard something of Miss Marple's reputation. He offered her a chair. He offered her, more surprisingly, his own attention. He asked whether she would be willing to tell him what she had observed. Miss Marple sat with her handbag in her lap and her feet neatly together. She said, in the mild voice she used in vestry meetings, that she had observed a great many things, but that most of them were of the kind that would not sound sensible if she said them aloud too soon. She said she would prefer, if the inspector would permit her, to observe a little longer. "Miss Marple," Inspector Slack said, "with respect, this is a murder investigation." "I am aware, Inspector," said Miss Marple gently, "that it is a murder investigation. That is why I should like to be quite sure before I speak." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed his notebook. He said, "You believe you know something." "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that I know one thing. I believe I know why the clocks in the West Wing stopped at 17 minutes past 3. And when I understand that, Inspector, I shall understand the rest." "And when do you expect to understand it?" "By tomorrow evening, I should think," said Miss Marple. She was mistaken, as it happened, by 9 days, but she did not know that yet. She thanked the inspector for his time and left the library, and she walked, with her small, careful steps, down the long corridor toward the drawing-room, thinking about clocks and about locked doors, and about a photograph of a young man in a military uniform that had been moved from the mantelpiece to the dressing-table by a woman who had known she was going to die. She did not, however, go straight to the drawing-room. She went instead to the housekeeper's pantry. Mrs. Renshaw had been at Witchwood for 29 years. She was a small, stout woman with rimless spectacles and a set of keys on a chain at her waist, and she had, when Miss Marple entered, been sitting perfectly still on a wooden chair with her hands folded in her apron and her eyes on the window. She rose at once. "Mrs. Renshaw," Miss Marple said, "may I sit down for a moment?" She sat down. She admired the row of copper pans on the wall. She asked, in a tone of polite curiosity, about the arrangement of the household keys. Mrs. Renshaw, who had spent 30 years being asked about copper pans by visitors and had answered every question as though it were the first time, told her, at some length, that the household keys were kept on a board in the housekeeper's pantry, and that only she and Lady Witchwood herself had the right to remove them. And the key to Lady Witchwood's bedroom? That key, said Mrs. Renshaw carefully, has hung on that board, Miss Marple, for 9 years. Since her ladyship's fall in the winter of the great snow, she insisted upon it. She said she would not have her door barred against those who might need to reach her in the night. Miss Marple nodded gently. And it was on the board yesterday evening? It was. And this morning? It was on the board this morning also, Miss Marple. When Alice came to me at 7 and said her ladyship had not answered her tea tray, I took the key from the board with my own hand. It had not been touched. How can you be sure, Mrs. Renshaw? The housekeeper hesitated. Then she said, in a voice a little lower than before, because I dusted the board yesterday afternoon at 4 o'clock, Miss Marple. I dusted every key on it, and when I took her ladyship's key down this morning, there was no mark upon the dust, no fingerprint, no smudge, nothing. It had not been moved since I dusted it. Miss Marple sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "Thank you, Mrs. Renshaw. That is exactly what I needed to know." She rose. She thanked the housekeeper again. She walked out of the pantry with the same small, careful steps with which she had walked in, and she stood for a moment in the long stone corridor between the pantry and the servants' hall, and she thought about what she had just been told. Because if the master key had not been touched, and the door of Lady Witchwood's bedroom had been locked from within, and the key had been in the inside of the lock when the door was opened, then there was only one further conclusion to be drawn from the fact that Lady Witchwood had, unmistakably, been murdered. The murderer had been in the room with her when the door was locked, and the murderer had never left. Miss Marple did not share this conclusion with Inspector Slack. Not yet, because a conclusion of that kind, arrived at in the middle of a morning by an elderly woman with a knitting bag, was not the sort of conclusion that inspectors from the county town were prepared to consider before their lunch. She kept it to herself. She walked instead into the long gallery, and she stood at the window that looked out over the yew hedges toward the maze, and she watched, quite calmly, as Julian Ashcombe walked slowly and alone along the gravel path toward the eastern end of the lawn. He did not go into the maze. He stopped at its entrance. He stood there for perhaps 3 minutes with his hands in the pockets of his overcoat. Then, without going in, he turned and walked back the way he had come. Miss Marple watched him all the way. She thought about a young man 40 years ago in the small parish of St. Mary Mead, who had been in the habit of standing on the little bridge over the mill stream every afternoon for a week without ever throwing anything into the water, and who had, at the end of that week, been arrested for a crime committed on the opposite bank of that stream 3 months before. He had never gone onto the bridge to look at the water. He had gone onto the bridge to look at the house behind it. She thought about Julian Ashcombe, standing at the entrance of the maze without going in, and she began, quite slowly and quite carefully, to consider what it was in the maze that a man might wish to look at without being seen to look. That afternoon, the household received a piece of news that changed the shape of the investigation entirely. Mr. Pruitt, of Pruitt, Beams and Pruitt, the family solicitor, arrived from Salisbury in a black motor car, carrying a leather case that had not been opened in 9 years, and he closeted himself with Inspector Slack in the library for 1 hour and 40 minutes. When he came out, he asked to see the family, and when the family had assembled, in the same morning room in which they had heard Sergeant Hobbs give them the news of the murder, Mr. Pruitt sat down on a small, hard chair and read to them, in a level lawyer's voice, the will of Lavinia, Dowager Lady Witchwood. It was not the will they had been expecting. The will they had been expecting, and which the entire county had assumed to be in force, had been made in 1959. Under that will, the estate of Witchwood, together with the residue of Lady Witchwood's personal fortune, would have passed on her death to her only son, Sir Rupert Witchwood, absolutely. The house, the lands, the paintings, the library, the maze, and the 800-year-old baronetcy of Witchwood would have become his in a single stroke. The will that Mr. Pruitt read out that afternoon had been made 4 months ago. Under this new will, the estate of Witchwood was to pass, in trust for her lifetime, to Miss Harriet Vane. There was, for a very long moment, no sound in the morning room at all. Then Rupert Witchwood, in a voice so quiet that Miss Marple would not have thought him capable of it, said, "Read that again, please." Mr. Pruitt read it again. Miss Marple, who had been watching the faces in the room with the attentiveness of a woman who had spent her life at village fêtes, saw a great many things happen in a very short time. She saw the colour leave Rupert Witchwood's face and return to it, brighter, in two uneven patches. She saw Celia Witchwood's hands, which had been so very still all morning, at last betray themselves by tightening on the arms of her chair until the knuckles showed white. She saw Dr. Prendergast turn his head slowly toward Miss Vane, with an expression that was not surprise so much as sorrow, as though he had known for some time that this news was coming, and had hoped it would not. She saw Julian Ashcombe, who had been standing again by the terrace door, look not at Miss Vane and not at Rupert, but at the small silver clock on the mantelpiece. And she saw Harriet Vane, at last, cover her face with her hands. She did not weep. She sat perfectly still with her hands over her face, and after a long moment she lowered them, and she looked at Mr. Pruitt, and she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "She did not tell me." Rupert Witchwood laughed. It was not a pleasant laugh. He said, "She did not tell any of us, Miss Vane. That, I take it, is rather the point." "Rupert," said Celia, without turning her head. "Rather the point," Rupert repeated more loudly. He stood up. He crossed to the fireplace. He stood with his back to the room and his hand on the mantelpiece, and Miss Marple saw the small tremor in his shoulders that was, in a man of Rupert Witchwood's build and habits, the visible edge of an enormous private storm. Mr. Pruitt, who had known the family for 30 years and knew when to keep his eyes on his papers, said, "There is a further clause, Sir Rupert, which I think it is only right that I should read to you." Rupert did not turn around. "By all means, Pruitt, let us have all the clauses." Mr. Pruitt read out the further clause. It said, in the careful language of lawyers, that in the event of Miss Harriet Vane predeceasing Lady Witchwood, or dying within a period of 6 calendar months following Lady Witchwood's own death, the estate should pass, absolutely and without further condition, to Sir Rupert Witchwood. The silence in the room, this time, was of a different kind. Miss Marple, in her chair by the window, folded her small hands more tightly around the top of her handbag, and thought, very clearly and very sadly, that whoever had killed Lavinia Witchwood had not, so far, killed the person they had needed to kill. Whoever had killed Lavinia Witchwood had killed her 9 days too soon. Because if the killer had known about the change in the will, the killer would have known that the death of Lavinia alone was not enough. The killer would have known that a second death was required. And if the killer had not known about the change in the will, then the killer had killed Lavinia for the wrong reason entirely, and would, within days, be discovering that fact, and would be turning, in whatever quiet corner of the house they now inhabited, toward Harriet Vane. Either way, Miss Marple thought, Harriet Vane had, at some point in the next 6 months, a considerably greater problem than the loss of her employer. Miss Marple sought out Harriet Vane later that afternoon. She found her in the small green sitting room at the back of the house, sitting on the window seat with a book open on her lap that she had, quite clearly, not been reading. The book was one of Lady Witchwood's own. It was a slim, faded volume of Tennyson, and it was open at a poem that Miss Marple, without looking directly, recognised as Mariana in the Moated Grange. She thought this was, in its own quiet way, a piece of information. Miss Marple sat down opposite her. She did not begin with kindness, because kindness in that moment would have been a small cruelty. She began, instead, with the ordinary. "How long," she said, "had you known, my dear, that Lady Witchwood was going to alter her will in your favour?" Harriet Vane looked up. Her eyes were dry. Her voice, when she answered, was flat. "I did not know at all," she said. "Are you certain?" "I am certain." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And yet you were not, I noticed, entirely surprised when Mr. Pruitt read it out." There was a long silence. Harriet Vane closed the book. She placed it on the window seat beside her with the small, exact care of a woman who had learned, in a badly paid life, that objects were the only things it was safe to be careful with. She said, at last, "I was not surprised, Miss Marple, because I had been afraid of it for nearly a year." "Afraid?" "Afraid," Harriet Vane said. She had begun, some months ago, to say things to me that I did not entirely understand. She had said once that she wished I had been her daughter. She had said another time that Witchwood needed a mistress who could love it without wanting to sell it. She had said, in the very last week of her life, that she had at last found a way of arranging matters as she would wish. I did not press her. I did not think it right to press her. But I was afraid. "You were afraid of the will?" "I was afraid," Harriet Vane said, "of what would happen in this house if she did what I thought she was going to do." Miss Marple considered her for a long moment. Then she said, "My dear, will you tell me one thing more?" "If I can." "Why did Lady Witchwood not trust her son with the estate?" Harriet Vane looked out of the window. Beyond the glass, the yew hedges were dark against the pale grey sky, and the maze, at the far end of the lawn, was already collecting the first of the afternoon's shadows. She said, in a voice so quiet Miss Marple could hardly hear her, "Because he had already, twice, tried to sell parts of it, without her knowledge, and she had, both times, only prevented the sale by an act of will so exhausting that I believe it took years from her life. He has debts, Miss Marple. Larger debts than he has ever told his mother. Larger debts, I think, than he has told his wife. And there is one man in London to whom he owes a very great deal of money, and who has, I understand, made it clear that he is not prepared to wait past the end of the year." Miss Marple sat quite still. She said, "Do you know the name of that man, my dear?" Harriet Vane hesitated. Then she said, "I heard it once, only once. Lady Witchwood spoke it into the telephone the week before she died, and she thought I was not in the room. She said the name with a kind of anger I had not heard from her before. She said, if that man ever set foot on Witchwood land, she would take a horsewhip to him herself." "And the name, my dear?" Harriet Vane looked at her. "The name," she said, "was Ashcombe." Miss Marple did not, on the outside, react. On the inside, a small, cold, satisfied door closed. She thanked Harriet Vane. She rose. She walked slowly out of the green sitting room and down the corridor toward the library, and she thought, as she walked, that the young man who had come to Witchwood Hall to catalogue books had not come to Witchwood Hall to catalogue books at all. He had come, in one way or another, on the business of a man in London to whom Sir Rupert Witchwood owed a great deal of money. And he had come at the invitation, presumably, of the debtor, which meant, among other things, that Sir Rupert Witchwood had known, before his mother's death, that his mother's death alone would not save him, which meant that Sir Rupert Witchwood, of everyone in the house, had the least possible reason to have killed her. She stopped in the middle of the corridor. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, quite still, with one hand on the wall. Then she went, not to the library, but back to the drawing room, and she rang the bell for tea. Because there were, she thought, at least 2 people in the house who might have had a very good reason for wanting Lavinia Witchwood dead before she could sign a further document, a document that Lavinia had never signed, and which was now, forever, unsigned. And one of those people had, that morning, been standing at the entrance of the maze without going in. Tea was served in the drawing room at 4 o'clock. It was, in the tradition of the house, a formal tea, with the silver on the little rosewood table and the toast cut into fingers, and it was attended, on that particular afternoon, by 5 people, and by a silence so heavy that the fire itself seemed almost embarrassed to crackle. Rupert Witchwood was drunk. It was a slow, controlled, respectable drunkenness, The drunkenness of a man who had been drinking since before lunch and who intended to go on drinking until he could no longer tell the difference between the room he was in and the room he wished he were in. He sat in the wing chair by the fire with a glass in his hand and stared, without blinking, at the pattern of the hearthrug. Celia sat on the sofa. She was pouring the tea. Her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were entirely steady now. Whatever had come over her that morning in the reading of the will had been packed away, at some point during the afternoon, into whatever quiet interior room Celia Witchwood kept for such things. She poured for Miss Marple, for Dr. Prendergast, for Harriet Vane, and, at the last, for herself. She did not pour for her husband. Her husband did not require tea. Dr. Prendergast was in the second wing chair. He had been reading the same page of a country newspaper for nearly a quarter of an hour without turning it. His bag, Miss Marple observed, was still at his feet, although there was no reason it should have been. It should, by rights, have been in the hall. Julian Ashcombe was not there. Julian Ashcombe had gone, so he had told Mrs. Renshaw, for a walk. Miss Marple accepted her tea. She accepted a slice of the lemon cake. She said, in her mildest voice, "It was a very quiet night last night, was it not? Until the wind rose." Nobody answered. "I could not sleep," Miss Marple continued gently, "and so I heard rather more of it than I might have wished. I heard the wind. I heard, once, a shutter knocking on the west wall. And I heard a key being tried, quite softly, in a lock somewhere along the west wing corridor." The silence in the room changed pitch. Rupert Witchwood looked up from the hearthrug. Celia's hand paused, half an inch above her saucer. Dr. Prendergast turned a page of his newspaper for the first time in 15 minutes and turned it the wrong way. Harriet Vane, on the far side of the room, went perfectly white. "A key?" said Celia at last, with the small, polite curiosity of a woman who has decided to speak because someone had to. "How curious. What time was that, Miss Marple?" "A little after 10:30, I should think." "Ah," said Celia. She lifted her cup. She sipped from it. She set it down again. "Then it will have been Harriet, no doubt. She is often out and about at that hour." Harriet Vane opened her mouth to answer and closed it again. Miss Marple smiled very kindly at Celia. She said, "It might have been Miss Vane, or it might have been somebody else. It was, I think, somebody who did not wish to be heard, because the person who was trying the key, you see, was trying it very slowly, almost tenderly. As one tries a key in a lock one has not, oneself, been given permission to open." Rupert Witchwood said thickly, "What are you saying, Miss Marple?" "I am saying, Sir Rupert," said Miss Marple, "that somebody in this house, last night, was attempting to enter a room to which they had no key, and I am wondering, out loud, which room that might have been." Rupert set his glass down on the arm of the chair with such care that the small chime it made against the wood was almost musical. He said, "Are you accusing somebody, madam?" "I would not dream of it," said Miss Marple. "I am merely telling you what I heard." The clock on the mantelpiece struck the quarter. Somewhere far above them, in one of the upper corridors, a door opened and closed with the small, distinct sound of a door being closed by somebody who did not know they were being listened to. Dr. Prendergast folded his newspaper. "Miss Marple," he said, in the level voice of a country doctor who has, in his time, told a great many people a great many pieces of bad news, "I wonder if I might have a word with you privately." "By all means, doctor," said Miss Marple. They went into the small bookroom across the hall. Dr. Prendergast closed the door behind them. He did not sit down. He stood by the window with his back to it, and he looked at Miss Marple for a long moment before he spoke. He said, "I have known this family, Jane, for 31 years. I am aware of that, Ambrose. There are things I have known about them," he said, "that I have not spoken of, and will not speak of, to any policeman. I would not expect you to. But there is one thing," he said, that I feel I ought to say to you, because you were her friend and because she wrote to you, and because I believe in my heart that Lavinia did not intend to die last night. She intended to alter the will. She had a further alteration in mind. She spoke to me of it a week ago in this very room. Miss Marple sat down on the small, hard chair by the desk. She said, very quietly, "What was the further alteration, Ambrose?" Dr. Prendergast hesitated. He looked out of the window. He looked back at her. He said, "She intended to name a further beneficiary, not in place of Harriet Vane, in addition to her. She had discovered, she said, that she had a further obligation which she had for many years refused to acknowledge. She would not tell me what it was. She said she would tell me when the papers were drawn up. The papers, Jane, were to have been drawn up this week." Miss Marple sat very still. She said, "Do you know, Ambrose, to whom this further obligation was owed?" "I do not," Dr. Prendergast said. "But I believe, Jane, that whoever it was, that person was in this house last night. And I believe that person knew of Lavinia's intention, and knew, therefore, that the alteration would be made unless something prevented it. And I believe, God forgive me, that something prevented it." Miss Marple looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Ambrose, may I ask you one further question?" "You may." "The photograph on Lavinia's dressing table, the silver frame, the young man in the uniform, that was not there when I visited last, 40 years ago. It was on the mantelpiece then. When did she move it?" Dr. Prendergast closed his eyes. He said, "She moved it last month, on the day, I think, that she made up her mind." "And the young man in the photograph, Ambrose?" There was a very long pause. "The young man in the photograph," Dr. Prendergast said, "was her son." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. She said, "Lavinia had only one son, Ambrose, and her son is sitting in the drawing room across the hall, drinking his brandy." Dr. Prendergast opened his eyes. He said, in the voice of a man who had carried a piece of information for so long that it had become a part of the shape of his shoulders, "Lavinia had 2 sons, Jane, and the older of them, whom nobody in this house has spoken of in 49 years, did not, as the family has always been told, die in the war." Miss Marple did not react. She had, in the course of her long, ordinary life, been told a great many secrets in a great many small rooms, and she had long ago learned that the correct response to a secret was to accept it with the same face with which she accepted a second slice of Victoria sponge. She folded her hands in her lap. She said, gently, "Tell me, Ambrose, all of it, from the beginning." Dr. Prendergast sat down at last. He sat on the small, hard chair opposite hers, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and he began, in the flat voice of a man discharging a debt to himself, to speak. "There was a boy," he said. "His name was Christopher. He was born in the summer of 1917, at a time when Lavinia's husband was in France. He was, by every appearance, a witchwood child. He had the witchwood mouth and the witchwood chin. He had also, and this is a matter no photograph could hide, the eyes of a young man who is not now in this county, and whose name I shall not speak, and whom Lavinia had, in that terrible summer, believed for 6 weeks to have been killed at Passchendaele. Her husband, when he came home in the autumn, did not, so far as I ever knew, ask the question. He raised the boy as his own. He never spoke of him with less than pride. Whether he knew, or whether he preferred not to know, I could not tell you, Jane, and I do not believe Lavinia herself could have told you. Some marriages hold themselves together on the strength of what is never spoken. "Go on," said Miss Marple. "The boy grew up here," Dr. Prendergast said, "in this house. He was gentle. He was clever. He loved the maze, oddly. He would go into it alone for hours as a child. His younger brother, Rupert, who came along 7 years later, could never bear the sight of it. They were, in every way, opposites. And when the Second War came, Christopher enlisted. He was 22. He was sent, in 1940, to North Africa. and in 1941, Lavinia received the telegram that all mothers of that generation lived in fear of receiving. Missing. Believed killed. Miss Marple said, "But he was not killed." "He was not killed," Dr. Prendergast said. "He was taken prisoner. He was held for 4 years. And when the war ended and the prisoners were released, he did not come home." "Why not?" Dr. Prendergast looked at his hands. "Because, in the last month of his captivity, Jane, he had done something. I do not know precisely what. He would never speak of it, even to me, and I saw him only once. He had, I believe, in the desperation of those last weeks, informed on a fellow prisoner, a friend, perhaps more than a friend. That prisoner had died, and Christopher, when the gates opened, could not bring himself to come home to a mother who would say, with pride, that her son had come back from the war a hero. He wrote to her from Cairo. He told her he was alive. He told her he would never return to England. He asked her to say to the family that he had died, and to allow the world to believe it. And she did what he asked, because she loved him, Jane. She loved him more than she loved the truth. Miss Marple sat very still. She said, "And where has he been, Ambrose, all these years?" "He lived for a time in Alexandria, then in Cyprus, then, so I understand, in a small town in the south of France. He wrote to her once a year on his birthday. She kept every letter. She never showed one of them to me. She spoke of him only twice in 49 years, and she spoke of him both times in the past tense, as though the boy in the photograph had been dead all this while, and the man writing the letters was somebody else entirely." "When did she change her mind?" "This summer," Dr. Prendergast said. "In July. She received a letter, I believe, that told her Christopher was ill, that he had not long to live, that he had a daughter in France whom he wished to acknowledge before he died. Lavinia went to see him. She was gone for 4 days. She told nobody except me, and me she told only because I had to sign her prescriptions in her absence. She came back changed, Jane. She came back with the intention of doing right by the boy in the photograph at last. She intended to leave a portion of her estate in trust to Christopher's daughter." "And that," said Miss Marple, "was the further alteration." "That was the further alteration." Miss Marple looked at the small clock on the desk. It said 4:15. She said, "Ambrose, who else knew?" Dr. Prendergast did not immediately answer. He said at last, "Only 3 people, so far as I am aware. Lavinia herself, myself, and at some point in the last month, one other person in this house, whom Lavinia at some point took into her confidence. I do not know which one, but somebody, Jane, somebody knew. Because when I came into her room this morning and I saw the photograph on the dressing table, I understood at once. It had been placed there deliberately. It had been placed there so that whoever came into the room would see it and would understand that she had died knowing why." Miss Marple stood up. She said, "Thank you, Ambrose. That was very brave of you." He shook his head. "It was 31 years too late, Jane." She said, "It is never too late, my dear, so long as the truth is spoken to somebody who will use it kindly." She left the little book room. She stood for a moment in the hall. Above her, the great staircase rose in its 2 long curves toward the upper corridors, and the last of the afternoon light was coming in through the tall lancet window on the landing, and it was falling in a long, slanted bar across the empty runner of the west wing corridor. She looked at it for some time. Then she went, quite deliberately, upstairs. She went to the door of Lady Witchwood's bedroom. It was closed now, and it was, on the orders of Inspector Slack, sealed with a small paper seal across the frame. She did not touch the seal. She stood in front of the door for perhaps a minute. She thought about the key on the dust-free board in Mrs. Renshaw's pantry. She thought about the key that had been found in the inside of the lock. She thought about the person who had, at 10:30 on the night of the murder, tried a key very softly in a lock somewhere along this corridor, and she asked herself, with the patience she reserved for problems that had one small hidden hinge and a great many false ones, which lock the second key had been intended for. She turned. She walked, very slowly, along the corridor toward the west wing. She counted the doors as she went. Lady Witchwood's room, the room that had been her husband's dressing room and was now, since 1958, unused. A linen cupboard. A guest bedroom kept always ready. A bathroom. And at the end of the corridor, tucked into the angle where the west wing met the servants' stair, a small door, painted the same colour as the wall, which most visitors never noticed. It was the door to the old nursery. Miss Marple stopped in front of it. She tried the handle. The door was locked. She stood there for a long moment. Then she walked back the way she had come, past Lady Witchwood's sealed door, past the tall lancet window with its bar of dying light, and down the great staircase into the hall. She rang the bell for Mrs. Renshaw, and when Mrs. Renshaw came, Miss Marple asked her, in a voice of gentle curiosity, when the old nursery had last been opened, and who, in the household, had a key to it. Mrs. Renshaw thought for a moment. Then she said, "The nursery has not been opened, Miss Marple, for 11 years. The key hangs on the board. It has hung there since Mr. Christopher's things were put away." "Only that key?" "Only that key, Miss Marple. There is no other." "And has the dust on the board around that key been disturbed, Mrs. Renshaw?" Mrs. Renshaw did not answer at once. She turned, and she walked ahead of Miss Marple down the stone corridor to the pantry, and she opened the door, and she went to the board, and she stood before it for some time. Then she said, in a voice quite unlike her own, "The key is gone, Miss Marple. It is not on the board." Miss Marple did not, for perhaps 5 seconds, allow anything to show on her face. Then she said, in the mild voice with which she had once informed a curate that the choir had been stealing from the collection plate, "Mrs. Renshaw, my dear, would you be so kind as to say nothing of this to anybody at all, until I ask you to?" Mrs. Renshaw, who had not become housekeeper of Witchwood Hall by asking questions, nodded once. Miss Marple walked back to the drawing-room. She sat down in the chair she had occupied at tea. The tea things had been cleared. The fire had been made up. Rupert had gone. Celia had gone. Only Harriet Vane remained, sitting in the window seat with a book she was not reading. She looked up as Miss Marple came in, and there was, in her eyes, the particular strained attention of a woman who has been waiting for hours to be told something, without being certain what. Miss Marple sat down opposite her. She said, "Miss Vane, my dear, I am going to ask you a question, and I should like you, if you can, to answer it plainly." "I will try." "You have been at Witchwood for 4 years." "Yes." "In those 4 years, has anyone ever spoken to you of a boy named Christopher?" Harriet Vane closed her book. She said very quietly, "Yes." "Who?" "Lady Witchwood herself. Once. On the evening of the 4th of July this year. She had returned that day from a journey. She had been drinking a little brandy, which was not her habit. She sat in this room for nearly an hour without speaking, and then she said to me, quite suddenly, that she had a granddaughter she had never seen, and that she intended, before she died, to bring her home." "Did she tell you the granddaughter's name?" "No." "Did she tell you where she was living?" "No. Only that she was in France." "And did she tell you," said Miss Marple, "the name of the granddaughter's father?" Harriet Vane looked at her hands. She said only that he was her elder son, that he had once been called Christopher, and that the world had, for 49 years, believed him dead. Miss Marple nodded very slowly. She said, "Miss Vane, have you ever seen the granddaughter?" Harriet Vane looked up at her at last. Her eyes, behind the plain spectacles, were the eyes of a woman who had understood, some hours before Miss Marple had asked the question, exactly what the question was going to be. She said, "I have not, Miss Marple. I have not seen her." "Do you know where she is at this moment?" "No." "Do you know whether she is in England?" There was a long silence. Harriet Vane said, "I do not know, Miss Marple, but I have wondered." "When have you wondered?" "Last night," she said, "and the night before, and the night before that." Miss Marple leaned forward very slightly. She said, "Miss Vane, why did Lady Witchwood tell you not to allow anyone to go to her room alone?" Harriet Vane's hands closed on the edge of the book. She said at last, "Because she was afraid, Miss Marple, that whoever wished her harm would come to her not as a stranger. She was afraid, I think, that they would come as someone she had been waiting for." Miss Marple sat very still. The fire in the grate settled. Somewhere in the corridor a clock struck the hour. And Miss Marple, in her small, quiet way, understood at last the shape of the thing that had been growing all day at the edges of her mind. She understood the moved photograph. She understood the door locked from the inside with no fingerprint upon the master key. She understood the second key, the missing key, the key to the old nursery at the end of the West Wing corridor. She understood the tried lock at 10:30. She understood the breath let out in the dark at 17 minutes past 3. She understood Julian Ashcombe at the entrance of the maze. She understood Dr. Prendergast's bag, which had not been in the hall where it belonged. And she understood, above all, why Lavinia Witchwood, on the last night of her life, had kissed her on the cheek in a manner that had astonished 40 years of restraint. Lavinia had not been kissing Miss Marple. Lavinia had been saying goodbye to somebody else, in the only way she could, in a room in which that somebody else was already listening. Miss Marple stood up. She said, "Miss Vane, my dear, I should like you to do one thing for me. I should like you to lock your bedroom door tonight, and I should like you to answer it, no matter what is said on the other side of it, to no one at all before 7 in the morning, not even to me. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Thank you, my dear." She went out of the drawing room. She went up the great staircase for the second time that afternoon. She went along the West Wing corridor, and she stopped, this time, not at the sealed door of Lady Witchwood's bedroom, but at the small painted door of the old nursery. She stood there for a long time. Then she lifted her small, gloved hand, and she knocked, very gently, 3 times. There was no answer. She knocked again, and this time, from inside the room, there came, quite softly, the sound of a chair being pushed back on a wooden floor, and the sound of a footstep, and the sound of a key being turned from the inside in the lock. The door opened. The woman who stood on the other side of it was perhaps 30 years old. She was slender and dark, and she had the eyes, unmistakably, of the young man in the silver-framed photograph on the dressing table 2 doors down. She was wearing a plain grey dress. She had been quite clearly weeping, and she looked at Miss Marple for a long moment without saying anything at all. Then she said, in a French-accented English so soft it was barely audible, "You are the friend from the village. She said you would come." "Yes, my dear," said Miss Marple. "I have come." The young woman stepped back into the room. Miss Marple went in. The young woman closed the door behind them and locked it again, from the inside, as though the habit of the last 3 days had already become the habit of a lifetime. The nursery was as it had been left 11 years ago, when the boy Christopher's boyhood things had been put away. There was a small iron bed. There was a rocking horse in the corner. There was a low bookshelf still filled with the books of a child. And on the little table by the window there was a pot of tea, gone cold, and a plate with the crusts of a single slice of bread, and a battered leather suitcase that had not yet been unpacked. Miss Marple sat down in the small wooden chair by the fireplace. She said, "My dear, tell me your name." The young woman said, "Elise." "Elise, and you are Christopher's daughter?" "I am." "Your grandmother brought you here?" "Yes." "When?" "3 nights ago, in the motor car, very late. She said no one was to know. She said she would tell them all, in her own time, when the papers were ready. She said until then I was to stay here. She brought me food herself, every day. She brought me the tea last night, at 10 o'clock. She sat with me for 1 hour. She told me she had been a very foolish and a very frightened old woman for a very long time. She said she was sorry. Then she went to her room. And she said she would come again, in the morning, with the lawyer. And in the morning she did not come. And a little later there was a scream, and I have not opened the door since. Miss Marple looked at her for a long time. She said, "Elise, my dear, did anyone else know you were here?" Elise looked at the floor. She said, "One person, madame. One person came to the door last night, very late, long after grandmother had gone. I did not open it. I was frightened. But the person spoke to me through the door. The person said, quite gently, that grandmother had sent them, that I was to open the door, that there was something I must be told." "You did not open?" "I did not open. Grandmother had said when she left me that no one was to be admitted, no one at all, only herself in the morning. So I did not open." And after a little while, the person went away. "Do you know," said Miss Marple, "who the person was?" Elise looked up. She said, "I know only the voice, madame." "Whose voice?" There was a long silence. Elise said, "It was a woman's voice, madame." Miss Marple sat very still. She said, "You are certain?" "I am certain." "A woman's voice you had heard before?" "No, madame, a voice I had not heard before, but a woman's voice, of that I am sure." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. She sat in the small wooden chair by the cold nursery fireplace for perhaps a full minute without speaking. Then she said, very gently, "Elise, my dear, I am going to ask you to stay here for one further night. I shall bring you your supper myself. I shall bring you a hot brick for the bed. And in the morning, when it is all over, I shall come to fetch you, and I shall take you downstairs, and I shall introduce you to the family that is, from this day forward, your family. Will you trust me?" Elise looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Grandmother said your name to me, madame, on the last evening. She said that if she was not there in the morning, I was to trust the small old lady from St. Mary Mead, as I would have trusted her." "Then that is settled," said Miss Marple. She rose. She went to the door. She turned before she opened it, and she looked once around the little nursery, at the rocking horse, and at the shelf of a child's books, and at the young woman standing in the middle of the room in her plain grey dress. And she thought that Lavinia Witchwood had, at the very end, done a brave and a good thing, and that a brave and good thing was, in a house like this, in a family like this, in a century like this, no small achievement at all. She let herself out. She heard behind her the small, deliberate sound of the key being turned again from the inside. She walked slowly back along the corridor. At the head of the great staircase she stopped. She stood for some time in the last of the afternoon light, and she thought, with the quiet sorrow of a woman who had seen this shape of thing before, about which of the two women downstairs had, at some point during the previous evening, gone silently up this staircase, along this corridor, and stood at the little painted door of the old nursery with a soft voice and a lie. Because a woman's voice at the nursery door meant, at once and without question, one of two women. And Miss Marple, who had watched them both across the drawing-room and the dining-room and the morning-room for a full day, had already, at the back of her patient old mind, formed an opinion about which. But she did not, yet, act upon it, because an opinion was not a proof, and in a house of 6 suspects and 1 corpse and a secret 49 years old, an opinion, said out loud in the wrong drawing-room, was the kind of thing that could get a young woman with French-accented English killed before breakfast. She went downstairs. She went quite calmly into the library, where Inspector Slack was still at work at the long table with a stack of statements before him and an expression of increasing dissatisfaction on his tired face. She sat down in the chair opposite him. She folded her hands in her lap, and she said in her mildest voice, "Inspector, I wonder if I might trespass upon your time for perhaps 10 minutes. There is something I should like to ask you to arrange for me for tonight. And there is something I should like, if I may, to tell you." Inspector Slack looked at her. Then he set down his pen. He said, "Miss Marple, I have been waiting for you to come into this room since 10 o'clock this morning." Miss Marple's arrangement with Inspector Slack was, in its way, a very small arrangement. She asked him for two things. She asked him to place a constable, in plain clothes, in the servants' corridor of the West Wing between the hours of 10 and dawn. And she asked him to permit her to invite the household at 9 o'clock that evening into the long drawing room on the pretext of a small announcement concerning the will. Inspector Slack, who had passed the greater part of the afternoon reading statements that contradicted one another in ways he could not yet reconcile, agreed to both requests without asking a single question. He said, "Miss Marple, when you make your announcement, will you be so good as to allow me to be present?" "I shall insist upon it, Inspector." "And will you be so good, before you make it, as to tell me one thing?" "If I can." "You know who did it?" Miss Marple looked at him with the small, sad smile of a woman who had spent a long life knowing things she had rather not have known. She said, "I believe, Inspector, that I know two things. I know who did it, and I know why. And I know that both of them, in the end, come to the same thing, which is that if we do not, tonight, bring this to an end, there will be, before the week is out, a second death in this house. And this time it will not be an old woman with her hair in a plait. It will be a young woman with a French accent and a suitcase she has not yet unpacked." Inspector Slack did not reply. He merely gathered his papers into a neat pile and set them at the corner of the table and went out to give his instructions. Miss Marple, for her part, went to her room. She sat by the window for some time. She looked out across the yew hedges at the maze in its dying afternoon light, and she thought, one final time, about the shape of the case, and about the small, precise fact that had been, from the very first hour, the hinge on which the whole thing turned. The door of Lady Witchwood's bedroom had been locked from the inside. The key had been in the lock from the inside. The master key on the housekeeper's board had not been touched. There were, therefore, only two possibilities. The first was that the murderer had been in the room when the door was locked, and had then, somehow, left it in a manner that no policeman had yet imagined. The second was that the door had never been locked from the inside at all. Miss Marple had, in her long life, seen a locked room mystery once before. It had been in the village of St. Mary Mead in 1929, and it had concerned a certain Mrs. Cartwright, who had been found dead in her bedroom, with the door locked and the key on the mantelpiece 6 feet from the bed. The truth of it, in the end, had been remarkably simple. The door had never been locked. The key had been placed on the mantelpiece by the murderer after the death, and the housekeeper, who had discovered the body, had testified in perfect honesty that she had unlocked the door, because when she had turned the key in the lock, she had felt it turn. What she had not known, and what the murderer had counted upon her not knowing, was that a key turning in an unlocked lock feels exactly the same, to a nervous hand, as a key turning in a locked one. Miss Marple thought about Mrs. Renshaw at 7 o'clock that morning at the door of Lady Witchwood's bedroom, with the tea tray on her arm and her heart already in her throat. She thought about how quickly Mrs. Renshaw would have turned the key. She thought about how honestly Mrs. Renshaw would have believed and would testify that the door had been locked. And she thought about the key that had been found in the inside of the lock, which was not the master key from the board, which had not, therefore, been the key that Mrs. Renshaw had used, which had, therefore, been placed there by somebody else, by somebody who had access to a second key, by somebody who had, in the small hours of the morning, gone into Lady Witchwood's room with a key that had never hung on the board, and had done what they had come to do, and had walked out, and had left the second key in the inside of the lock as they went. There was, in Witchwood Hall, exactly one door in exactly one wing whose key had, 49 years ago, been made in a set of 2, A door that had, over the course of a boyhood, needed to be opened and closed by more than one person, and whose spare key had, in the ordinary way of country houses, been forgotten in the back of a drawer somewhere. The old nursery. Which meant that whoever had killed Lavinia Witchwood had, at some point in the past month, discovered the existence of Elise, and had discovered where in the house Lavinia had chosen to hide her, and had, at some point, removed the spare key of the nursery from wherever it had been forgotten, and had used it on the night of the murder, not to enter the nursery, but to enter Lady Witchwood's bedroom. Because the key of the nursery, in a house of ill-fitting Georgian locks, had for 80 years fitted every door on the West Wing corridor. It was the sort of thing that everyone in the family had known once, and everyone had forgotten once the family had grown too old to have children in the nursery. Everyone except one person. Miss Marple sat by the window until the last of the light had gone from the sky. Then she stood up. She smoothed her dress. She fetched her knitting from the little table by the bed, and she went downstairs to the drawing room, where the household, one by one, was already beginning to gather for the announcement she had asked Inspector Slack to permit her to make. The drawing room, at 9 o'clock that evening, had the look of a room that had been waiting all day for the thing that was now about to happen. The fire was up. The curtains were drawn. The heavy brocade at the tall windows shut out the wind, which had, for the second night running, begun to rise. The lamps on the little tables had been lit at their lowest setting, and the room, in that soft yellow light, looked older than it had at any point during the day, as though the house itself, having released one of its long secrets, had aged a quiet half-century in the space of 12 hours. Rupert Witchwood was in the wing chair by the fire. He was almost sober now. He had washed and shaved and put on a dark suit, and he sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the carpet, in the attitude of a man who had, at some point in the afternoon, decided to stop drinking, and had not yet decided what to do instead. Celia sat on the sofa. She was in black. She had not been in black at breakfast, and she had not been in black at tea, and Miss Marple, who noticed such things, made a small, silent note of the fact. Dr. Prendergast sat in the second wing chair, and this time his bag was in the hall where it belonged. Harriet Vane sat in her usual straight-backed chair at the edge of the group, with her hands folded in her lap. And Julian Ashcombe, who had returned to the house shortly after 7, stood, as he always stood, a little apart from the others, near the tall glass door that led out to the terrace. Inspector Slack was in the room. He was not sitting. He stood with his back to the fireplace and his notebook, for once, closed. Sergeant Hobbs was in the hall beyond the door, quite quietly, where he could be neither seen nor forgotten. Miss Marple sat down in the small chair by the window. She placed her knitting on her lap. She did not take up the needles. She said, "I have asked Inspector Slack to permit me to speak to you all this evening, because a mistake has been made in this house, and it will, unless we prevent it, be followed within the next few days by a second and much greater one. The first mistake was made last night, at 17 minutes past 3, in the bedroom of Lady Witchwood. The second mistake, unless we are careful, will be made before the week is out." Nobody spoke. "I shall come to the second in a moment," said Miss Marple. "I should like first to speak of the first." She looked mildly at Rupert Witchwood. She said, "Sir Rupert, you did not kill your mother." Rupert Witchwood raised his head very slowly. He said, in a hoarse voice, "I did not." "No," said Miss Marple, "you did not. You had, I quite understand, a very great many financial reasons for wishing that the old will should remain in force. You had, I understand also, some rather pressing debts, and there is a gentleman in London whose patience with regard to those debts is not, at present, unlimited. That gentleman had, so I understand, sent a representative to this house last month, on the very reasonable pretext of cataloguing the library, in order to satisfy himself as to the true condition of the Witchwood estate before extending his patience any further. Is that not so, Mr. Ashcombe?" Julian Ashcombe did not immediately answer. He looked at Miss Marple for a long moment, with an expression in which, at last, something very like respect made itself visible for the first time. Then he inclined his head very slightly. He said, in a quiet voice, "It is so." "You are not," said Miss Marple, writing a book about the 18th century witchwoods? I am not. You are here on the business of a Mr. I shall not embarrass you by naming him, to whom Sir Rupert owes a considerable sum. I am. And you did not kill Lady Witchwood, Mr. Ashcombe, because your employer had, on the contrary, a very strong interest in her continuing to live, at least until certain arrangements could be made for the settlement of Sir Rupert's debt against the estate. That is correct, madam. Thank you, Mr. Ashcombe. Miss Marple turned her attention next to Dr. Prendergast. She said, Ambrose, you did not kill Lavinia. Dr. Prendergast said, I did not. You told me the truth this afternoon in the book room. I told you the truth. You had loved her, I think, for a very long time. Dr. Prendergast looked at the fire. He said in a voice barely above a whisper, I had loved her, Jane, for 42 years. I know, said Miss Marple. I have known since dinner last night. She looked next at Harriet Vane. She said, Miss Vane, you did not kill Lady Witchwood either. Harriet Vane closed her eyes. You are the only person in this room, said Miss Marple gently, who would have gained the entire estate by her death, and you are, for that very reason, the only person in this room who I have never for one moment considered. Because in 4 years, Miss Vane, you did not, so far as I can see, take a single small liberty in this house. You did not ask for a rise. You did not order the smallest article for yourself upon Lady Witchwood's accounts. You did not accept the proposal of marriage of the curate of Chipping Underwood, though it would have been the making of you, because you would not leave a mistress who was becoming, month by month, more dependent upon you. A woman of that character, Miss Vane, does not kill her employer for a country house. She does not, if I may say so, know how. Harriet Vane opened her eyes. She did not speak, but something in the set of her small, pale mouth altered. Miss Marple looked at last at Celia Witchwood. She looked at her for a long time. Then she said, in the same mild voice with which she had spoken to the others, Celia, my dear, what time did you take the spare key of the old nursery from the drawer of the writing desk in your husband's dressing room? The room, for perhaps 3 seconds, was entirely without sound. Celia Witchwood did not move. Her hands remained still on her lap. Her face did not change. Only her eyes, for one moment, betrayed her, and then they steadied, and she said, with the small, controlled amusement of a woman who had been asked at a dinner party a slightly indelicate question. I do not know what you mean, Miss Marple. I think, my dear, said Miss Marple, that you do. Celia laughed. It was a short, cold, well-managed laugh. She said, Really, Miss Marple, this is the most extraordinary conversation. Am I to understand that I am being accused, in my own drawing-room, of the murder of my mother-in-law? You are, said Miss Marple. Rupert Witchwood, in the wing-chair, made a small sound and half rose from his seat. Miss Marple did not look at him. She continued to look at Celia. She said, You went to the nursery, my dear, sometime between 10 and 10:30 last night. I heard you try the key in the lock. The girl in the nursery, quite sensibly, did not open to you. You went away. You waited. At a little after 3 in the morning, when the house was asleep, you went to Lady Witchwood's bedroom instead. The key of the old nursery fitted her door, as it fitted every door in that corridor. You let yourself in. Lady Witchwood was awake. She had, I think, been waiting for you. She did not cry out. She did not, as I understand it, even sit up. She simply looked at you. You did what you had come to do. And when you left, you turned the key of the nursery once in her lock, as though to lock it behind you, and you left the key there, so that in the morning it would appear that the door had been locked from within. You knew that Mrs. Renshaw, in her hurry and her fear, would testify quite honestly that the door had been locked. Because a key turned in an unlocked door, my dear, feels exactly the same, to a nervous hand, as a key turned in a locked one. Celia's face had, at some point in the last minute, become the colour of the pearls at her throat. She said, in a voice that had gone very quiet, "You cannot prove any of that." "No, my dear," said Miss Marple, "I cannot. Not by myself. But there is a woman upstairs in the old nursery at this moment who heard your voice at her door last night. And there is, on the key that was found in Lady Witchwood's lock this morning, a small brass tag with the letter N stamped upon it, which is the tag that belonged to the spare key of the nursery, and which has, for some 11 years, lain in the writing desk in your husband's dressing room, which is, as it happens, the only room in this house that you have any regular reason to enter." Celia's hand at that moment moved for the first time. It moved to the small string of pearls at her throat and closed on them. She did not speak. Miss Marple leaned forward very slightly. She said, in a voice softer than any she had used all evening, "You did not do it for the money, my dear. Did you?" Celia did not answer. "You did not do it," said Miss Marple, "for the estate. You did not do it, I think, even for your husband. You did it because Lavinia had told you, at some point during the summer, what she intended to do. She had told you about Christopher. She had told you about the girl. She had told you because she believed, mistakenly, that you would understand. Because you had, yourself, once had a child who did not live. A child of whom your husband, I think, has never known. And Lavinia, in her old wish to make peace with the world at last, believed that of everyone in this house, you were the person most likely to welcome another woman's daughter into it." Celia's hand on the pearls went white. "But you did not welcome her, my dear," said Miss Marple. "You could not welcome her. Because if Lavinia acknowledged that girl and set her portion aside from the estate and brought her into this house as a granddaughter, then the son that you had lost, the child that no one in this family had ever been told about, would remain forever unacknowledged. And you could not bear it. It was not the money. It was not the property. It was the door being opened to another woman's child, while the door had been kept shut for 16 years to yours. And so, at 17 minutes past 3 this morning, you closed that door, my dear. You closed it in the only way you thought you could." Celia Witchwood at last began to weep. She did not weep loudly. She wept in the way that certain women weep when the last thing that has been holding them together has quite quietly given way. Rupert Witchwood in the wing chair looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, and on his heavy, florid face there arrived, very slowly, the expression of a man who had just understood, for the first time in 16 years, why his wife had been unhappy. Inspector Slack stepped forward from the fireplace. He said, very quietly, "Mrs. Witchwood." He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Sergeant Hobbs came in from the hall. Celia Witchwood was taken from Witchwood Hall at 10 past 10 that evening. She went, in the end, quietly. She did not ask for her coat. She did not, at the door, look back at her husband. She looked instead at Miss Marple, and for one moment there passed between the two women a look of understanding that had in it nothing of forgiveness and nothing of judgment, but only the recognition of one woman by another that a life had been lived, and that a great deal of it had gone wrong, and that most of it might have been prevented if any of them had, at any point along the way, said the true word at the true time. Then she went out. The door of the drawing-room closed behind her. The wind, which had been rising all evening, threw itself against the tall windows in a single soft gust that made the lamps flicker, and then subsided. And in the drawing-room of Witchwood Hall, 5 people sat in the silence of a house that had, at last, been allowed to breathe again. Rupert Witchwood was the first to speak. He said, in a voice that was neither drunk nor sober, but only tired in a way that no one in that room had ever heard him tired before. "I did not know, Miss Marple. About the child. She did not tell me." "No, my dear," said Miss Marple. She did not. I should have known. You would have needed to be a different man, Sir Rupert, to have known, and she would have needed to be a different woman to have told you. These things are so, unfortunately, and no amount of understanding of them afterwards can be turned back into the time in which they might have made a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and he lowered his head, and he did not lift it again while Miss Marple was in the room. Dr. Prendergast rose from the wing chair. He said quietly, "Jane, may I fetch her?" "You may, Ambrose." He went out. The door closed, and Miss Marple, in her small chair by the window, sat with her hands folded on her knitting and waited, in the patient way of a woman who had waited all her life, for the last remaining piece of a broken family to come down the great staircase and into the room to which she had, at last, been called. Elise Witchwood entered the drawing-room at 20 minutes past 10. She came in slowly. She was still in the plain grey dress. Her small suitcase was in her hand, and she stopped just inside the door when she saw the 4 faces turned toward her from around the fire. She looked at Rupert first. She looked at him for a long time. She had, Miss Marple noticed, brought with her from the nursery the silver-framed photograph of the young man in the uniform, and she carried it now, held against her, as though it were the letter of introduction it in some sense was. Rupert Witchwood rose from the wing chair. He crossed the room to her. He stopped an arm's length from her. He looked first at the photograph, and then at her face, and then at the photograph again, and then, finally, only at her face. And Miss Marple, who had seen a great many resemblances in a great many faces in a great many lifetimes, saw the moment at which Sir Rupert Witchwood understood that the young woman standing in front of him was, in the deepest sense the word could carry, his niece. He said, in a voice quite unlike any voice he had used all day, "Elise." "Uncle," she said. He put his hand on her shoulder, very lightly, as though he were afraid the gesture might, in some fashion he did not yet understand, break her. Then he stood aside, and he said to the room as much as to himself, "This is my brother's daughter. She will live here, if she wishes to, for as long as she wishes to. She will be, from this day forward, of this family." Harriet Vane rose. She crossed the room. She took Elise's suitcase quietly from her hand. She said, "Your grandmother had a room prepared for you. She wished it to be your mother's old room on the south side. I shall show you the way." They went out together. Dr. Prendergast at the door turned back once. He looked at Miss Marple. He did not speak. Then he followed them out, which left in the drawing-room 3 people, Miss Marple in her chair by the window, Sir Rupert Witchwood in the wing chair by the fire, and Julian Ashcombe still standing quietly by the terrace door as he had stood all evening. Rupert looked up at last. He said, "Mr. Ashcombe." "Sir Rupert." "You will, I take it, be leaving in the morning?" "I shall." "You will convey my regards to your employer?" Julian Ashcombe inclined his head. He said, "I shall convey to my employer, Sir Rupert, that the estate of Witchwood, as of tonight, is in circumstances quite different from those which he had been led to expect. I shall convey to him further that the debt outstanding will, I believe, be honoured in full within the calendar year, if you tell me so." Rupert Witchwood looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Tell him so." Julian Ashcombe bowed very slightly and went out. Miss Marple heard his footstep on the stone floor of the hall, and then, a moment later, the sound of the study door closing behind him. She rose. She gathered her knitting. She went across the room to Rupert Witchwood, and she stood beside his chair for a moment, and she laid her small hand on the back of it. She did not touch him. She said quietly, "I am very sorry, my dear." He did not look up. He said, "So am I, Miss Marple, so am I." She left him there. She walked slowly across the drawing-room and out into the hall. Inspector Slack was waiting for her at the foot of the great staircase. He inclined his head, as Julian Ashcombe had done, but with a different meaning. He said, "Miss Marple, thank you." "Not at all, Inspector. I shall be quite candid with you. I should not, on my own, have arrived at Mrs. Witchwood. You would have arrived, Inspector, in time. Would I? Miss Marple smiled at him very gently. She said, You would have arrived, Inspector, at the second death, and you would have known then what you did not know now. But the second death, you see, was the one it fell to me to prevent. She wished him good night. She climbed the great staircase slowly, one step at a time, with her small gloved hand on the banister. She went along the corridor to her room. She did not look in passing at the sealed door of Lady Witchwood's bedroom. She did not look in passing at the small painted door of the old nursery at the far end. Both of them, she felt, had, in their own ways, been at last allowed to become ordinary doors again. She went into her room. She closed the door. She sat down for a long moment on the edge of the bed. She thought about Lavinia. She thought about a girl of 17 at a garden party in 1917, with a young officer beside her whose name would never be written down. She thought about a woman of 34 keeping her husband's silence at a christening. She thought about a mother of 78 driving alone through the night to a small town in France to ask forgiveness, at the very last, of a son she had spent 49 years pretending had died. She thought about how much of a life could be spent, quite quietly, in the careful arrangement of a lie, and how, if the lie was arranged carefully enough, the arrangement itself could become a kind of love. And she thought, with the small, clear grief of a woman who had lost a friend she had not been close to and would nevertheless miss, that Lavinia Witchwood had, at the very end, done the one right thing left to her to do, and had died, without complaint, for the doing of it. She put out the lamp. She lay down. Outside the leaded window, the wind, which had risen and fallen all evening, at last settled. Somewhere in the west wing, in a room that had been closed for 11 years, a young woman was lying down to sleep for the first time in a bed her father had slept in as a boy. In the drawing room below, a man who had misunderstood a great many things for a great many years was sitting alone by the fire and beginning, at last, the slow work of understanding some of them. And in a small cell in the county town, 7 miles away, a woman in pearls was sitting on a narrow bed and looking at her hands, and thinking, perhaps, of a child she had lost 16 years ago, and of the door she had opened at 17 minutes past 3 that morning, and of how, in the end, the door had not closed at all. Miss Marple lay in the dark for a long time. She did not sleep at once. She thought about a smile she had seen in a churchyard when she was 19 years old. She thought about how, in every murder she had ever known, there had been, at the beginning, a moment at which somebody had decided that another person's life could be ended for the sake of a wound of their own. And she thought that the only defence against such moments, in any village or any house or any century, was the small, tireless attention of the people who chose to notice. She closed her eyes at last. She slept. And Witchwood Hall, which had locked itself at 17 minutes past 3 that morning, unlocked itself, quietly and without ceremony, at some point in the small hours of the following one, and let the first thin grey light of the second morning come in through its tall windows, and lie across the empty rug in front of the drawing-room fire, and touch, very gently, the silver-framed photograph that had been set back at last upon the mantelpiece where it had always belonged. In the days that followed, Mary Mead behaved as St. Mary Mead had always behaved on such occasions, which is to say that everybody in the village agreed, quite quickly, upon a version of events that was almost, but not quite, the truth, and that everybody stuck to it with a firmness that had, in it, the small collective mercy of a small collective community that had, over the centuries, learned when to know a thing exactly and when to know it only in outline. The version the village agreed upon was that Lady Witchwood had died in her sleep, that Mrs. Witchwood had suffered a collapse of the nerves in consequence of the shock, and had been removed for her health to an institution in the north, and that a young French cousin of the family, whom nobody had previously heard of, had come down to help Sir Rupert with the reorganisation of the estate. This version was repeated without significant variation in the post office, in the butcher's, at the Wednesday sewing circle, and in the vestry of St. Peter's, until it acquired, by sheer weight of repetition, the character of a thing that had always been known. Nobody, of course, believed it entirely. Villages of that sort never do. But everybody was prepared, out of a certain old-fashioned decency, to behave as though they did. And that, in most villages, is the most that can be asked. Miss Marple returned to her small house on the third day. She resumed the tending of her front hedge. She was seen, on the following Sunday, in her usual pew, listening to the sermon with her hands folded and her eyes on the middle distance, and if anybody had happened to notice that her lips, once, moved very slightly during the general confession, they would not have supposed, and could not have supposed, that the confession she was making was on behalf of a woman she had, in a country house 7 miles away, delivered to a police inspector 6 nights before. She wrote, one afternoon, a long letter to Elise Wychwood on plain cream paper in her small, clear hand. She sent, with it, a small pot of quince jelly from her own kitchen and a single sprig of rosemary from her garden, pressed carefully between 2 sheets of tissue. She received, a week later, a reply written in French-accented English on the notepaper of Wychwood Hall. It thanked her. It told her that the rose garden, which nobody had thought would bloom again that year, had put out 3 late blossoms that morning. It said that Sir Rupert had spoken for the first time of the brother he had believed to have died in the war. It said that Dr. Prendergast had come to dinner the previous evening, and that he had, in the middle of the second course, laughed for the first time in a long while at nothing very much. It said that Miss Vane was staying on, at Elise's own request, as her friend and companion. And it said, at the very end, in a hand that had been steady until the last line, "Grandmother told me, madame, that you would understand. I did not know then how much." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. She placed it, with the letter from Lavinia that had begun the whole affair, in the small mahogany box on her writing desk in which she kept the correspondence that mattered. She closed the lid. She locked the box. She did not open it again. There was, some months afterwards, a small paragraph in the county newspaper, so short that most readers passed it over without noticing. It said that a woman of 38, formerly of Wychwood Hall, had died in the sanatorium to which she had been committed for observation of what the newspaper described, with the kindly vagueness of country journalism, as a wasting of the Constitution. The newspaper did not name her. It did not need to. The village read the paragraph in silence. The village lowered its voices for perhaps a week. And then the village, in the way of villages, moved on. Miss Marple, when she read the paragraph, put the newspaper down on the little table by her chair, and she sat for some time with her hands folded, and she thought about Celia Wychwood as she had first seen her across the dining table at Wychwood on the evening of October the 16th, playing with her wedding ring as though it were a small, unpleasant animal she could not quite decide whether to keep. She thought about the child that no one had known of. She thought about how many quiet, unnoticed griefs, in how many quiet, unnoticed drawing rooms, went, in the end, unattended into the dark. She thought that the world would have been, on the whole, a better place if any of them had thought, at any point, to ask. Then she took up her knitting. She resumed her work on the small blue jacket she had begun for the vicar's new grandchild. She did not think of Wychwood Hall again that evening, or the next. There was, however, one further chapter to the affair, and it happened in the spring. It happened at Wychwood Hall on a fine morning in April, when the plane trees on the drive were putting out their first leaves and the walled garden was beginning to remember what it had once been. Miss Marple had been invited down for the weekend. The invitation had come in Elise's own hand. It had said, simply, that certain things had been put in order at last, and that Elise would consider it a very great kindness if Miss Marple could be there when they were spoken of. Miss Marple caught the 4:15 from St. Mary Mead. The train stopped at Wychwood Halt in the last of the afternoon light. A motor car was waiting. It was driven by Sir Rupert himself, who was thinner than she remembered and greyer at the temples, and who had, she noticed at once, the small, quiet steadiness of a man who had stopped drinking some time in the winter and had not, so far, been sorry. He said, "Miss Marple, it is good of you to come." "It is a pleasure, Sir Rupert." "You will find," he said, "that the house is a little altered." She did. The house was a little altered. It was not that the furniture had been moved, or the pictures rehung, or the rooms repainted. It was that the house itself, in the manner of very old houses that have carried a secret for a long time, had unclenched. The hall breathed. The drawing-room caught the light. The long gallery, which had for as long as Miss Marple could remember been cold at every hour, was, that afternoon, quite warm. And on the mantelpiece in Lavinia's old sitting-room, the silver-framed photograph of the young man in the uniform stood in its proper place, and beside it stood a second frame, quite new, in which was a small snapshot of a dark-haired man of perhaps 50, standing at the door of a whitewashed cottage in a country of olive trees, with a small child on his shoulders. "Christopher," Sir Rupert said, when Miss Marple's eyes rested on the second frame. "That was taken, we think, in 1968. Elise found it among his papers. The child is Elise herself." Miss Marple looked at the photograph for some time. She said, "He looks kind, Sir Rupert." "He was, I understand, very kind." "I am glad." Dinner that evening was a small dinner. There were 4 of them at the long table: Sir Rupert, Elise, Miss Vane, and Miss Marple. Dr. Prendergast had been expected, but had sent word at the last moment that a patient in the village had detained him. He would come, he had said, for coffee. And so he did. He came in a little before 9, still in his heavy overcoat, and he took the 4th armchair by the drawing-room fire, and he accepted a cup of coffee from Elise's own hand, and he sat for some time in the silence of a man who was, on the whole, content. It was in that silence, after Miss Vane had refilled the cups, that Elise, sitting on the low stool by the fire, said, "There is one thing, madame, that I have wished to ask you since the winter, if you will permit me." "Of course, my dear." Elise looked into the fire. She said, "In the drawing-room, on that evening, when you spoke of my Aunt Celia, you said that she had lost a child, that my Uncle Rupert had never known. Was that so? Or was that a thing you said in the moment because you thought it would compel her to speak?" The room, quite gently, went still. Sir Rupert did not move. He was looking at his hands. Dr. Prendergast, in his armchair, was looking at the fire. Miss Marple set down her cup. She said, "It was so, my dear." Sir Rupert looked up. He said, in the voice of a man who had already made his peace with the answer he was about to receive, "How did you know, Miss Marple?" "Because," said Miss Marple gently, "I saw her on the morning that she was arrested, my dear, in a black dress that she had not been wearing the day before. She had been in Wychwood only 3 days. She had not, so far as I could see, brought mourning down with her from London, which meant that the black dress, Sir Rupert, was a dress that had been in her wardrobe for some other reason. A woman does not carry a full mourning dress about with her, in the country, in the autumn, for no reason at all. And I have known in my life several women who did, and every one of them had lost a child, and had kept, in the back of their wardrobes, the small black dress they had worn on the day of the burial, and had put it on again from time to time, in secret, when the grief of it had come upon them in a room in which no one else was watching." "She never told me," Sir Rupert said, very quietly. "No, my dear, she did not." "When was it? The child, I mean." Miss Marple looked at him with great gentleness. She said, "I do not know, Sir Rupert. It was not for me to ask her. If you wish to know, there are letters, I imagine, or a hospital record, or a small mark in a parish register somewhere, if you wish. But you may prefer, my dear, not to wish. Some things, you see, are known better in outline than in the exact particulars." Sir Rupert was silent for a long time. Then he nodded once. He said, "Thank you, Miss Marple." Elise, from her low stool, reached up and took his hand. She did not say anything. She did not need to. And Miss Marple, looking at the small, quiet tableau of the 4 of them by the fire, the man who had been given a niece in place of a wife, the woman who had been given a family in place of a father, The country doctor who had been given, at last, the peace of a spoken truth, and the paid companion who had been given, in Elise's affection, a home she had never expected, thought that the estate that had locked itself forever on the night of October the 17th had, in fact, unlocked itself at last, and that the key that had turned in the lock had not, in the end, been any of the keys any of them had believed it to be. It had been, quite simply, the truth, which was, as she had told Inspector Slack 6 months before, never too late, so long as it was spoken to somebody who would use it kindly. She stayed at Witchwood until the Monday morning. She walked on the Sunday afternoon with Elise through the walled garden, which was beginning at last to bloom. She admired, at Bramble's insistence, the tulips he had planted for her personally along the south wall. She looked in passing at the maze, which was in leaf again, and she thought about the boy Christopher, who had loved it as a child, and about how, in the strange working of these things, the maze had, in the end, given up its secret to a small, dark-haired woman from a country of olive trees who had never seen it before in her life. She caught the 10:15 back to St. Mary Mead. Sir Rupert drove her to the station. He stood on the platform until the train had gone, and he waved, once, as she went past, in the manner of a man who had not, until that moment, remembered how to wave to somebody with any feeling in it at all. Miss Marple settled herself in her seat by the window. She took out her knitting. She looked out at the hedgerows, which were breaking into green after the long winter, and she thought, for one last time, about Lavinia. She thought about a letter that had come in a heavy cream envelope. She thought about a sentence that had been read 3 times before it had been believed. She thought about a friend of 60 years who had, on the last night of her life, kissed her on the cheek in a manner that had astonished 40 years of restraint, and had done so, Miss Marple now understood, not out of affection and not out of farewell, but out of the small, deliberate wish to be quite certain that her old friend from St. Mary Mead should know, past all doubt, that she had been chosen. Chosen to be the one who would, when the morning came, understand. Miss Marple thought about this for some time. Then she took up her needles. She began, very quietly, on the second sleeve of the small blue jacket for the vicar's new grandchild. Outside the window the hedgerows went past. The train ran on, and somewhere far behind her, at the end of a long drive lined with plane trees, Witchwood Hall, quite gently and without any ceremony at all, went on with the ordinary business of being, at last, a house in which people were allowed to live. But some people, in the village, still believe the true story was never quite told. They will tell you, if you sit long enough in the snug of the Blue Boar of a winter evening, that there was a night in October when every clock in the West Wing stopped at 17 minutes past 3, and that a door somewhere in the house closed on a secret that was never fully spoken, and that a small old lady with a knitting bag walked out of Witchwood Hall on a bright Monday morning, carrying the last of it away with her, folded into her coat, when nobody would ever again think to look for it. And that, perhaps, is the truest ending of all, because the estate that locked itself forever on the night of October the 17th did open again in the spring, but the room at the end of the West Wing corridor, the little painted door of the old nursery, was closed by Mrs. Renshaw's own hand on the morning Elise came downstairs to breakfast, and it has not, so far as anybody in that house has ever admitted, been opened since. Some doors, when they close at last, are meant to stay closed, and some silences, when they settle at last upon a house, are the kindest thing that can be given to it. But somewhere, on a bright morning in April, in a country of olive trees, a very old man sat in the sun outside a whitewashed cottage and was told, by a letter that had been 6 weeks in the coming, that his mother had, at the end, done a brave and a good thing, and that his daughter was safe, and that a house he had not seen in 49 years was, at last, standing open again in the light. And he closed his eyes, and he did not answer the letter. And a little while afterwards, on an afternoon nobody has ever recorded, he set the letter down on the table beside him, and he did not pick it up again. But some people still believe the real truth of what he thought in that last quiet hour in the sun was never written down. The end.